Now we can address some of your concerns with higher order thinking skills and informal comprehension. I think one of the ones that will immediately work for you would be leveled questions. And so we would look at adapting questions that you're going to ask along the Bloom's level continuum, even the higher level Bloom's continuum, to your students' particular English ability, oral proficiency ability. And so do you think you could identify where your students fall along that English proficiency continuum? For example, there's pre-production stage, there's early production, speech emergence, and then intermediate fluency. Do you think you're able to identify where your students fall along those lines?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the stages, and I'm almost positive I could accurately identify where all my students fall.
That's excellent, because that's going to be the first step in doing the leveled questions, because we need to know how much the students can respond with how much English proficiency they can respond, so that you can create questions that are appropriate to their level of English proficiency. And we're also going to look at Bloom's taxonomy so that we could develop those questions along the different continuums, so that you're not just asking them, like you said earlier, tending to ask them just knowledge, fact-based type questions, so that we could ask them higher level questions and really know what they know and what they're learning.
So you mentioned Bloom's taxonomy. I've heard old Blooms and new Blooms. Which is the best for these kind of strategies, and where does that kind of, I guess, fall in line with what we're talking about?
That's a good question. Basically, the old Blooms and the new Blooms are identical, very similar. The only difference for our purposes in creating the stems and making sure that we're looking at the different levels would be in terms of the wording that they use. So the new Blooms tends to be more action-oriented, so you'll see their levels described in terms of verbs, like remembering, and whereas with the old Blooms, you'll see terms that are more noun-related, like knowledge, and that's the only difference. And so in terms of using either one of the Blooms, it's going to work really well for you. And actually online, most of the question stems that I want you to look at online are going to still focus on the old Blooms, because they're essentially the same. And so you could just go online and type in Bloom's taxonomy question stems, and you'll see a plethora of sites that'll come up. And what I would like you to do is just get some index cards that you could easily punch a hole in and fasten with a ring. And you can have one card for each of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and on them just write some of the question stems that we offer in our toolkit or that you can find online. And you put the little ellipsis marks at the end for each question so that you can use it in different settings. Either add more to the question, or that's where you solicit the response from the student. And so this way you can use this in a very planned way. So while you're creating a lesson, if you actually script some of your questions, you can use the cards, or you can use them spontaneously. And that's one of the things that I did in my classroom. I just would carry them around and make sure I turned to each card enough, got a good distribution of them, and pulled questions, from the different categories to ask students.
Oh yeah, I think I can definitely do that.
And actually, as a matter of fact, when I use these in my classroom, it just so happened that each of my cards was a different color. And the students knew, because I had introduced them to the concept of knowledge and along the Bloom's taxonomy. And so when I would approach them to ask them a question, they knew that if they were in the blue section, that it was going to be a little bit more of a challenge for them. And so it was just really cute to see them, following along. So they knew what I was doing in terms of my instruction and asking them questions as well.
Oh yeah, that's cool. I think I could definitely implement something like that in my classroom. So will the questions at the higher level require the student to have to speak more, or how does that work?
Yes, one would think so. However, when you're leveling the questions, you're able to avoid obligating the student to have a certain level of English proficiency in order to be able to respond to those higher type of questions like evaluation, synthesis, and application. And so we're going to be very purposeful with our leveled questions to allow them to be able to respond at that level without having a lot of English ability. So even someone at the early production stage can be able to answer these types of higher order questions. What you do as a teacher is you would really have to think of a question, break it down, and even allow for a yes or no response. You might even allow a response that requires a gesture like a nod or pointing to something as well. And then if you break the questions down, you may need to go through 3 different levels of Bloom's, to be able to work up to that point. So you may not ask the evaluation question or the synthesis question right away. You may have to start with knowledge and then just build to an application, then maybe eventually the synthesis question.
Oh, wow. Yes. And they don't have that money. Now the bank's going to come back and say, well, you don't have this money, neither does she. You've already wrote into your account that they've already given you $50. Now the bank's saying they're no good for it.
Right.
So now they owe you $50 and you don't have that $50. So you need to credit your
Account 50. Account.
yes. No, you're cutting your
So
cash.
Cash. Okay. So it's cash you don't have.